Welcome to the Deal Doctor live stream. It's Monday, 1 o'clock. Thanks for joining. It's good to be back. I've had a few weeks off and out of this chair, and I want to give a special thanks to Paul Brooks for pinch hitting last week. In the future, we plan to introduce you to more of the faces of our broker support team in our Deal Doctor live streams, so please stay tuned. Today, we're going to try something a little bit different. We're going to pose a question in a poll format, and in the future we're going to pose more of them at the beginning of the live stream. It's always been our objective to make this live stream interactive with agents who are viewing it in the moment, and we hope that participating in the poll will be a step forward in accomplishing that objective. So today's question is, do you need an acknowledgement signature to make a contract enforceable? Yes or no? Again, do you need an acknowledgement signature to make a contract enforceable? Let me explain what an acknowledgement signature is. It is the signature which occurs after the parties have reached a meeting of the minds. For example, a buyer submits an offer and the seller accepts the offer as written, no counter offer. That is, at that moment, is an enforceable contract. It does not require that it go back to the buyer and have them acknowledge that the seller accepted their offer as written. If, for example, the seller counters the offer and the buyer accepts that counter offer, it is that moment that the contract becomes enforceable. Again, it doesn't have to go back to the seller in order to get their approval. So I'd just like to get your opinion on that as it regards what your knowledge base may be on that situation. So post your answer and take a moment, and in future live streams we're going to post additional questions. For example, is a buyer required to sign the seller's disclosure of condition form or lead-based paint disclosure? Yes or no? Per the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, is the seller's signature required on the buyer's written notice to terminate the contract based on inspections? And what is considered written notice? Is it a text message? Is it email from an agent? Or is it an addendum? Should agents record texts and emails in their transaction files in dot loop? Yes or no? Must a seller wait to put their home back on the market until a mutual release is fully executed? Yes or no? So, if you're watching today, I'm actually going to cover those questions, so you'll have a head start in future sessions with those who aren't watching. So, let's start with paper trails and why they're important. Paper trails, or electronic trails nowadays, are very important because they establish the evidence of signatures or lack thereof, and the dates and times documents were signed, exchanged, delivered, and so on. It establishes the time when an offer was accepted and when a seller was put on notice that the buyer is terminating based on inspections, for example. For example, your buyer accepts a seller's counteroffer at 11 o'clock a.m. and shares it with the listing agent via email or via dot loop at 11:10 a.m. According to Michigan law, the fully executed purchase agreement was delivered to the agent at 11:10 a.m. It doesn't matter what time the agent opens the email or logs into dot loop. That offer was delivered the moment that the agent pressed the button send. When do you need a signature and when don't you need a signature? Well, what about on a seller's disclosure form? Does a buyer have to sign a seller's disclosure form? In common practice, they do in the course of a transaction. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, can we force anyone to sign a contract of any kind, whether it's a disclosure, lead-based paint? We can't force anyone to sign anything. However, again, back to electronic trail, it's important to have a record of when you shared that document with the buyer or buyer's agent, so that you can say, yes, we did share the seller's disclosure statement on 2:30 p.m. on Friday the 21st or whatever the day might be. And so, again, same with the lead-based paint or any documents. We can provide them for their signatures, but if they choose not to sign them, it doesn't mean that the contract is invalid. What about terminations of contracts? This is an area where it's really important to understand your contract that you're using and what is afforded according to that contract in terms of, for example, inspections. What happens if you have inspections on the property and the buyer determines that they don't want to move forward? Does the buyer have the right to unilaterally terminate the contract? Or same holds for well and septic inspections or title work or surveys. All of those things are reasons that a buyer may elect to not move forward. The manner in which your contract, each individual contract that you're using out there, and I think we've got about 14 of them out there now, will dictate whether or not both parties have to agree to terminate the contract, or one party can do it unilaterally. For example, in the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, paragraph 15 clearly stipulates that if a buyer has inspections performed and finds them unsatisfactory, the buyer has the sole right to terminate the contract. The other option is they can make a proposal, but they have the unilateral right to terminate the contract. They can simply say, based on paragraph 15 regarding inspections, buyer hereby terminates the contract. Over, done. It doesn't need the seller's agreement. What does need the seller's agreement is the mutual release, which is why we use a two-step process at 5-Star. And that is, we send over a termination of the contract on an addendum. Again, buyer, based on paragraph 15 regarding inspections, hereby terminates the contract. That's one document, an addendum to the purchase agreement, which kills the purchase agreement. And then on a separate document, we have the hold harmless, which essentially determines who gets the money. And that is done largely because of escrow law. There's always the question, if this is the only vehicle you use to terminate the contract, is the contract ever terminated if all parties don't sign the mutual release? So I caution that this two-step process is really important. It's something that we've had our attorneys review, and they agree that the two-step process is the most effective and protects 5-Star and its clients in the course of terminating a contract. For example, a seller gets a proposal from a buyer about they want the seller to fix the roof based on inspections. Again, under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, the seller then has the unilateral right to terminate that contract. They don't need the buyer's permission to terminate it. They can terminate it, and they can put the house back on the market because the buyer has indicated that they are potentially not moving forward with the transaction. Texts and emails. Texts and emails have a way of getting lost, disappearing. Something happens to your phone, you drop your phone in the water, and it's going to be very difficult to get those text messages back. Sometimes agents change email providers, but don't archive all of their emails from a previous email provider. And so the email that a year later might be really, really important is gone. So we encourage you to copy those texts into a PDF through a Word document saved as a PDF, for example, and upload those into your .loop transaction file and label it as, text and email messages. Because if we ever got called into court, that's going to be evidence. And making it a permanent record in .loop is going to be extremely helpful in us defending you and 5-Star and our clients. So, I'm going to go back to the poll question and explain that if it wasn't obvious when I when I explained it. There is no acknowledgement signature required on the purchase agreement. It is historically, well, it's an enforceable contract without one. Historically, the Michigan Red Book required an acknowledgement signature to make the purchase agreement enforceable. However, court rulings take precedence, and the courts have held that the contract occurs when the parties reach a meeting of the minds. That is, their signatures to the agreement in terms, not an acknowledgement that the other party signed. So the court has essentially made law here by setting a precedent that says when you have reached a meeting of the minds between the two parties, that's enough. That's all that's required to make an enforceable contract. Seller's disclosure form, lead-based paint, the FSRE affiliated business addendum, all of those do not require a client to sign those, whether it's a buyer or seller. In the seller's disclosure and lead-based paint, the seller has to sign it, but the buyer doesn't, and a client does not have to sign the FSRE business affiliated relationship agreement or disclosure. We can't force anybody to sign anything, but what is important is that we maintain a record of when those documents were shared with that client, buyer, whoever it might be that we're dealing with. So again, we can't force anybody to sign a seller's disclosure form, a buyer to sign a seller's disclosure form or a lead-based paint. We can't force a seller or buyer to sign the affiliated business arrangement disclosure. But we can make sure that we have proof that we have shared it with them and we have in fact disclosed to them. So that's kind of the answer to that question. Does it, what was the other question? Let me scroll back for just a second. Do we have to get a agreement, a seller's signature, if a buyer, under the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement language, for example, if a buyer terminates based on inspections, well inspections, title work, survey, whatever it might be, that stipulates it gives the buyer the right to terminate the contract unilaterally, we do not need the seller's signature. Conversely, if the buyer has made a proposal under paragraph 15 of the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, the seller has the right to terminate without the buyer's permission. We don't need their signature to make it enforceable. One of the questions that I posed here was, should we load texts and emails into the permanent dot loop form, and of course, I think I answered it just a moment ago. Yes, too often they get lost or deleted inadvertently. Your phone gets lost or damaged, and copying those items to the dot loop permanent file will help archive that in a permanent way. We get this question a lot. The buyer's agent just sent me a note that said the buyer is not going to pursue the transaction. They want out. They're done. We're sending over a mutual release or a termination based on inspections, whatever it might be. And the question we get is, do we have to, as a listing agent, do we have to wait to put the house back on the market until we get that fully executed mutual release? And the answer is no. When you get something in writing from the buyer or the buyer's agent that says that they are not going to proceed with the transaction, you have the right to put the property back on the market. A word of caution, however, if you get an offer before you get that mutual release, I would encourage you to have the language put into any contract that the seller's acceptance of this offer is subject to a mutual release on a prior offer, just to make sure that we haven't sold the house twice and we're not going to get blowback from the previous buyer's attorney or something. So just be very careful about that, and put the house back on the market, get it back on the market as soon as you know that the buyer is not going to proceed with the transaction. A couple of other things that have come up over the course of the last few weeks that I'd like to chat about briefly. Dual agency. There are very, very few occasions where dual agency is necessary. And those occasions are where you already have a seller under contract for a listing and a buyer under contract as your buyer, and you're their buyer's agent. In that situation where you have the listing and the buyer already in place, then you might find that dual agency is unavoidable. It's also unavoidable when there's a relationship status. For example, the seller is my brother, the buyer is my sister, for example. When you have a relationships with both of them, a judge is going to say, who were you representing here? And the truth of the matter is that you were probably trying to do your best to walk the middle of the road. When you are in a dual agency position, however, you cannot give advice to either party that could prove advantageous to the other party. So you can't advocate for your buyer or your seller if you are acting as a dual agent. You can basically say, here's the papers, let me know what you want to do. And then they're going to say to you, now wait a minute, Don. They're not going to call you Don, they're going to call you something else. But anyway, they're going to say, wait a minute, I'm paying you $10,000 in commission and you can't give me one piece of guidance? And then you nod your head and say, yeah, that's true, I can't, sorry. What'd you decide? Well, a lot of sellers and buyers aren't going to feel real good about that because they signed something that said you were going to represent them, granted as a dual agent and therefore under limited agency responsibilities. Nevertheless, they're probably not going to be happy about it. So when you get a conflict that arises in a transaction after you've gone into dual agency, wow, then you've got a real problem because you can't advocate. Even if you think that the buyer is entitled to their EMD back, the buyer did nothing wrong, you can't say that to the buyer because that would be giving them advice in contradiction to the good or to the best interests of your seller, who is also your client, equally your client. So be very, very careful about dual agency. Avoid it. The best place to be is to stay in the seller's position if you have a listing. If someone comes to the door and says, I want to buy this house, I don't have a real estate agent, before you take a haircut on your commission, there's another document that you have to have signed and displayed on the MLS, which is a variable rate or dual commission arrangement, which says that if, as a listing agent, I get the buyer, I have a buyer, I'm double dipping it, to use the vernacular of the business, and I'm going to shave my commission by 1 or say 2% or even 3%. If I do that and I have not posted on the MLS that there's a variable rate commission agreement established, or in other markets like Grand Rapids, it's going to be called a dual commission arrangement. So if that doesn't say yes and disclose in the agent comments what that is, then you're probably opening yourself up to a potential grievance committee complaint if there's a competing offer that comes in and you've given your commission a haircut in order to get this offer accepted, that where you're working with the buyer. So be very, very careful before you go into that dual commission arrangement situation, that you're not putting yourself at risk. Okay, another thing that has come up a bit is verifying information which is presented for your listing on the MLS. We want to help avoid lawsuits. We want to stay out of court as much as we can, because it's time consuming and expensive and emotionally draining. Court is not a fun place to be. Preparing for court is not a fun place to be, or a grievance. As listing agents, it is our job to make sure that the information that we're putting out there is correct. Now, the other argument can be made is that, well, the buyer's agent's responsible for verifying. It says right on the MLS that they have to verify that all information is correct. I can assure you, having been in the courtroom or in the mediation room, that it's not that simple. The courts will not look at that disclaimer if there is any hint of neglect on the part of the listing agent to make sure that the information that they give is accurate. So, for example, if there are representations like buildable vacant lot, if you make that representation on the multiple listing, what is your support of that? Buildable where? Is it buildable at the point, at the location where the buyer wants to build? And if not, then is it a buildable lot all over, or just this part of it, for example? Relying on sketches. I know that there are companies out there who will do sketches of room sizes, and they're approximate. It says right in their disclosure, these are approximations, not to be relied upon, blah, 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 blah. Guess what? If the lawyers get a hold of it, they'll ignore that little tiny disclosure completely and say, this was up to the listing agent to verify this information that is being used to promote this property. If the disclosure is perceived to be fine print by a judge, it will probably be considered an inadequate disclaimer. So, there's just a few fun things for today. Any questions? No questions. Okay. I think that's enough for today. I think that hopefully will give you some food for thought, and hopefully we'll get some answers to the poll question, and see how we do. So thanks for visiting. Next week we're going to, I think, have a holiday, and then we'll be back to it 2 weeks from today. So, again, thanks for joining, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.